Christopher Reeve's Superman versus Henry Cavill's Superman, which one is the better Man of Steel? We have several criteria to go through, the first of which is their public personas, both as Clark Kent and as Superman. For Christopher Reeves, his Clark Kent is a masterclass in disguise, a complete 180 from his actual self. A mild-mannered and bumbling reporter whose presence in a room sort of fades away and whom no one takes too seriously. For Cavill, his Clark Kent disguise hardly conceals his identity. You could go so far as to say that his Clark Kent is simply Superman wearing glasses. Anyone can see through that. There's no attempt to alter his voice pattern, his posture, or his mannerisms, as is the case with Reeves. For Christopher Reeve's Superman, it's not just about the glasses. So the Superman with the better disguise of Clark Kent definitely goes to Christopher Reeve by a mile. Next, we move on to their public persona as Superman. For Christopher Reeves, he appears to be quite comfortable in the spotlight, giving a full media interview with Lois and intervening in the UN. The film makes it a point to highlight that no task is too trivial for him, whether it's stopping a bank robbery or saving a cat from a tree. What is also highlighted is how friendly and easygoing this Superman is, often found with a welcoming smile on his face. As for Cavill's Superman, he is a lot more stoic and reserved. You can almost always see the tension and the trepidation in his eyes. But to be fair, his reveal to the Earth was associated with General Zod's invasion, so it's understandable that the public would be afraid of him. Also, this Superman has a general mistrust of Earth's citizens, given that he feels more of an outcast. Cavill's Superman has a steeper slope to climb in terms of winning the public's approval, and given the circumstances, I feel he's doing his best. But overall, the Superman with the better public persona still goes to Christopher Reeves. Next, let's look at their respective moralities, namely their willingness to take a life. In both cases, this is no better exemplified than in their dealings with their version of General Zod. For Cavill's Superman, he received a lot of flack for his killing of General Zod, but perhaps unfairly so. Zod was too dangerous to be left alive, and he has nothing to live for except revenge against Superman, declaring that he will never stop until he destroys everything he cares about. And at the present moment, he was about to laser innocent civilians to their death. Cavill's reaction of stopping Zod can therefore be said to be a reasonable action in light of the circumstances. Contrast this with Reeves' Superman, who killed an already depowered Zod. Zod and his companions were neutralized and of no threat, and yet Superman still chose to end his life. Now, of course, you could argue that Zod could still find a way to regain his powers just like Clark regained his, but the threat level is way less significant than with Cavill's Zod, and perhaps not deserving of a kill. So the Superman with the better morals, with the greater focus on preserving lives, would be Cavill's Superman. And speaking of morals, let's move on to another aspect, namely their acts of petty revenge. For Christopher Reeve's Superman, his act of revenge is seen with the truck driver at the diner in Superman 2, the one who beat him when he was powerless. In return, Clark returns to the diner and allows the man to punch him and break his hand. For Cavill's Superman, his act of revenge is seen with also a truck driver. But here, Clark secretly destroys his truck for disrespecting him and the waitress. So, which is worse, to have your hand broken or your truck destroyed? Both acts of revenge are highly disproportionate to the initial offense. A destroyed truck might be a loss of livelihood, but there's a chance that it could be covered by insurance. A broken hand, however, would put the man out of work for months, and that is if he regains full usage of it in the first place. Not to mention, it wasn't the wisest thing for Clark to show off his invulnerability publicly in the presence of others. At least Cavill did his act of revenge in secret, as we would assume. So the Superman with the worst form of petty revenge goes to Reeves' Superman. Moving on, let's consider which Superman had to make a bigger personal sacrifice for the sake of Earth. For Reeves' Superman, his temptation would be to interfere too much in the affairs of humans, a fact which Jor-El dissuaded him from doing so, as they would become overly dependent on him. This would culminate in the events of the Quest for Peace, where Superman would forcibly destroy all nuclear weapons on Earth, before realizing the futility of his efforts. So, in a sense, Reeves' Superman had to sacrifice his ego, his belief that he could solve more of humanity's problems than he could. Now, Reeves' Superman also makes another huge personal sacrifice, but we'll get to that in another section. For Cavill's Superman, His temptation would come from his need for belonging. After wandering the Earth, seeking for purpose, he gets a glimmer of hope when Zod and his fellow Kryptonians showed up. But too bad they were on a genocidal mission that would end all current life on Earth. Now, I'm not saying that Superman here was tempted to join Zod in the terraforming of Earth. It was abundantly clear he was against the idea from the get-go. But perhaps he might have wished that things were different, that Zod could maybe terraform another uninhabited planet instead. Surely some part of him laments the fact that he had to destroy every last vestige of his home world and sever the only surviving link to his heritage for the sake of Earth's continuance. If that doesn't seal the deal, then Cavill's Superman showed that he was willing to give his life for the sake of Earth. So, in light of all this, I'd say the Superman who made a bigger personal sacrifice would be Cavill's Superman. Next, let's look at which Superman had to overcome the greater public scrutiny. Now, this ties back to their public personas as the Man of Steel, and as we've seen, Cavill's Superman had it much rougher here. His reveal to the world brought up deep topics like alien life and the idea of a false god, as some were rejecting the notion of relying on him to save them. Not to mention, Lex Luthor was constantly trying to frame him in the worst light possible at every turn. For Reeve's Superman, he was fortunate enough that the world was in a peaceful state upon his reveal, and he had a much easier time in getting the public to adapt to him. Of course, some of this ties in with his charisma in dealing with the public, but overall, the Superman who had to overcome the greater public scrutiny would be Cavill's Superman. Now, let's look at their worst moment of folly, or to put it more bluntly, their stupidest decision. For Reeve's Superman, there are a few, one of which would be not closing the chest containing the kryptonite when he first encountered it. Yes, it certainly weakened him, but as we see, Superman was still able to lift the kryptonite chain off himself just slightly when he was in the water, so he might have been able to shut the case if he had tried. But then again, perhaps the shock of the moment was quite overwhelming, so we can let this one slide. Rather, the biggest mistake that Reeve's Superman made would come in Superman 2, where he would give up his powers for the sake of being married to Lois. Never mind the invasion of Zod that would soon come after. Even if that didn't happen, it was still a foolish decision, one where he would never be as useful to Earth as he has always been. Think of all the people he could save, but will now be powerless to do so because he decided to settle down. Jor-El would disapprove of his son allowing Earth to depend too much on him, but sacrificing his powers would be swinging to the other extreme. Fortunately, this mistake was reversed, and it adds to the personal sacrifice that Reeve's Superman would undertake for the sake of Earth. As for Cavill's Superman, there are a few noteworthy blunders as well, such as allowing the government to take custody of Zod's body, which eventually fell into Luthor's hands. Or it could be simply not talking Batman down and explaining the situation to him, thus avoiding his subsequent kryptonite beatdown. But perhaps his most foolish decision would be not giving Wonder Woman the kryptonite spear and let her handle Doomsday instead. Even without the spear, she appears to be able to hold her own against the creature, so it stands to reason that she could have finished the job with the spear. Plus, Batman also had the gas grenade to temporarily weaken it. If Superman had simply let her deal with Doomsday, he could have avoided his death, and Steppenwolf would have not invaded Earth successfully. But sometimes, in the heat of battle, it's not easy to make decisions on the fly, and oftentimes the quick decision isn't always the right one. So while his death was avoidable, we can't blame Cavill too much here. So between the two biggest mistakes that we've seen for them, I think Reeve's Superman takes the cake here, given that it was more self-centered. And finally, let's look at their response to grief. For both Superman, this would revolve around the death of Lois as the initiating point. For Cavill's Superman, in a possible future, the death of Lois caused him to become a cruel and tyrannical ruler over Earth, one who no longer values human life as he once did. For Reeve's Superman, in the actual events of the film, he doesn't turn evil, but we do see an instance of raw, unfiltered rage that could mirror the emotions of Cavill's Superman. Any turning to evil is averted by his ability to turn back time, which brought his Lois back to life. But breaking the laws of nature is somewhat reckless, and is something that Jor-El would have forbidden his son from doing. Nonetheless, we'll never know if Reeve's Superman would ever fully turn to evil like Cavill's Superman if Lois wasn't brought back, and for this reason we can't really make a fair comparison between the two. So perhaps it's best to leave this to speculation and exclude this one from the list. Now, with all that in mind, who is the better Superman? Ultimately, better is subjective, and you might have a different set of criteria from which you'd assess them. My favorite Superman is still the Christopher Reeves version, but given the characteristics we've discussed, I feel Cavill's Superman comes out as the better hero. He had better morals, a bigger hurdle to overcome, and his biggest mistake wasn't as bad as that of Reeves. But what do you think? Which is your preferred Superman and why? Let me know in the comments.